Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to this latest reading of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We'll be on section 2 of the 4th chapter today. So section 4 or chapter 4, section 2. As always, if you're here with us in the live Discord reading, that means you can find a copy of the PDF that we're using for this in the pinned section of the Discord, which on mobile is to the top right when you hit the ellipsis. And if you're on computer, it looks like it's in the same place as well. So you can get the PDF in the pinned section. And if you're listening on the YouTube, of course, the PDF is going to be in the description for y'all, conveniently located. So with that said, let's get started on chapter 4. Technological stagnation and distortion of the African economy in the pre-colonial epoch. So, it has already been indicated that the 15th century European technology was not totally superior to that of other parts of the world. There were certain specific features which were highly advantageous to Europe, such as shipping and, to a lesser extent, guns. Europeans trading to Africa had to make use of Asian and African consumer goods, showing that their system of production was not absolutely superior. It is particularly striking that in the early centuries of trade, Europeans relied heavily on Indian cloths for resale in Africa, and they also purchased cloths on several parts of the West African coast for resale elsewhere. Morocco, Mauritania, Senegambia, Ivory Coast, Benin, Yorubaland, Lolango were all exporters of to other parts of Africa through European middlemen. Yet by the time that Africa entered the colonial era, it was concentrating almost entirely on the export of raw cotton and the import of manufactured cotton cloth. The remarkable reversal is tied to technological events in Europe and to stagnation of technology in Africa owing to the very trade with Europe. Cloth manufacture in the world went through a stage of handlooms and small-scale craft production. Up to the 16th century, that was the general pattern in Africa, Asia, and Europe, with Asian cloth makers being the most skilled in the world. India is the classic example where the British used every means at their disposal to kill the cloth industry so that British cloth could be marketed everywhere, including inside India itself. That's some dastardly shit. I'm going to kill a market that's built on your natural resources all over the globe and then keep some of what I steal from you for myself and then use that shit to develop the materials and then sell it in your country where I made it impossible for you to do the same. Like, that's some capitalist logic, I suppose. That's crazy as fuck. So, in Africa, the situation was not so clear-cut, nor did it require as much conscious effort by Europeans to destroy African cloth manufacture, but the trend was the same. Zoe said that's still the economic policy America pursues to this day. Absolutely. That's what makes it wild, because it's like, shit, name your country, just close your eyes, spin around with your finger pointed out, out of the globe, and whatever country you land on, you'll probably find an example of a country that America is doing this in, or to, or with. That's the fucked up part, including inside India itself. In Africa, the situation was not so clear-cut, nor did it require as much conscious effort by Europeans to destroy African cloth manufacture, but the trend was the same. Europe benefited technologically from its external trade contacts, while Africa either failed to benefit or actually lost. Vital inventions and innovations appeared in England in the late 18th century after profits from external trade had been reinvested. Indeed, the new machinery represented the investment of primary capital accumulated from trading and from slavery. African and Indian trade strengthened British industry, which in turn crushed whatever industry existed and that is now called the underdeveloped countries. That's wild. Rodney and Parenti seem to be in complete solidarity on even the usage of the term underdeveloped. It's like he's calling it underdevelopment for the sake of like doing like a scientific analysis, but really he's like critiquing the idea that what happened is underdevelopment at all rather than like hyper exploitation. So like clearly Parenti must have engaged with some Walter Rodney in his day. Like that seems pretty likely. The African Africans demand for cloth was increasing rapidly in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, so that there was a market for all cloth produced locally as well as room for imports from Europe and Asia. But directed by an acquisitive capitalist class, European industry increased its capacity to produce on a large scale by harnessing the energy of wind, water, and coal. The European cloth industry was able to copy fashionable Indian and African patterns and eventually to replace them, partly by reestablishing a stranglehold on the distribution of cloth around the shores of Africa, and partly by swamping African products with by importing cloth in bulk. European traders eventually succeeded in putting an end to the expansion of African cloth manufacture. There are many varied social factors which combine to determine when a society makes a breakthrough from small-scale craft technology to equipment designed to harness nature so that labor becomes more effective. One of the major factors is the existence of a demand for more products that can be made by hand, so that technology is asked to respond to a definite social need, such as that for cloths. When European cloth became dominant on the African market, it meant that African producers were cut from the increasing demand. The craft producers either abandoned their task in the face of cheap available European cloth, or they continued on the same small hand worked instruments to create styles and pieces for localized markets. Therefore, there was what can be called technological arrest or stagnation, and in some instances, actual regression, since people forgot even the simple techniques of their forefathers. The abandonment of traditional iron smelting in most parts of Africa is probably the most important instance of technological regression. Development means a capacity for self-sustaining growth. Development means a capacity for self-sustaining growth. That's interesting. Note that. It means that an economy must register advances, which in turn will promote further progress. The loss of industry and skill in Africa was extremely small if we measure it from the viewpoint of modern scientific achievements or even by standards of England in the late 18th century. However, it must be borne in mind that to be held back at one stage means that it's impossible to go on to a further stage. Yeah, you got to beat one level before you can get to the next, typically speaking. When a person was forced to leave school after only 2 years of primary school education, it is no reflection on him that he is academically and intellectually less developed than someone who had the opportunity to be schooled right through to university level. Yeah, you're not even playing on the same playing field at that point. What Africa experienced in the early centuries of trade was precisely a development opportunity. A loss was precisely a loss of development opportunity, and this is the greatest importance. One of the features associated with technological advance is a spirit of scientific inquiry closely related to the process of production. This leads to inventiveness and innovation. During the period of capitalist development in Europe, this was very much the case. The historians lay great emphasis on the spirit of inventiveness of the English in the 18th century. Socialist societies do not leave inventions merely to chance or good luck. They actively cultivate tendencies for innovation. For instance, in the German Democratic Republic, the youth established the Young Innovators Fair in 1958, calling upon the intellectual creativity of socialist youth, so that within 10 years of over 2,000 new inventions were presented at that fair. So much for lack of innovation on the part of socialists that like these capitalists. Well, socialism doesn't promote innovation. Like what innovation does capitalism promote anyway, huh? Like I don't consider like the same goddamn bread with like 42 different fucking brands on 42 different loaves at the supermarket that there are 42 different versions of in my city to be innovation. But that's just me, you know. That's just me. The European slave trade was a direct block in removing millions of youth and young adults who are the human agents from whom Imperialism springs. Those who remained in areas badly hit by slave capture were preoccupied about their freedom rather than with improvements in production. Besides, even the busiest African in West Central or East Africa was concerned more with trade than with production because of the nature of the contacts with Europe, and that situation was not conducive to the introduction of technological advances. Zoe said, when people aren't stressed out about trying to survive, they have a lot more intellectual bandwidth for creativity and innovation. Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, I don't know. I had I had an okay time surviving during the pandemic, and it gave me it gave me enough mental it relieved enough mental strain that I could conceive of bread theory and be here with y'all in a way where had it not been for that situation, I might not have ever considered doing something like bread theory. So that's the reality of the situation. Freedom breeds thought processes, and that leads to coming up with all kinds of ideas. That's why they don't want the working class having any kind of freedom to talk with each other, because what the fuck do they think we would be talking about if not trying to get ourselves out from under this colonial situation? So that's very important. So the European slave trade was a direct block in removing millions of youth and young adults who are the human agents from whom inventive springs. Those who remained in areas badly hit by slave capture were preoccupied about their freedom rather than with improvements in production. Besides, even the busiest African in West Central or East Africa was concerned more with trade than with production because of the nature of the contacts with Europe. And that situation was not conducive to the introduction of technological advances. The most dynamic groups over a great area of Africa became associated with foreign trade, notably the Afro-Portuguese middlemen of Upper Guinea, the Akan market women, the Udro traders of the Bight of Biafra, the mulattoes of Angola, the Yao traders of Mozambique, and the Swahili and Wanyamwezi of East Africa. The trade which they carried on was in export items like captives and ivory, which did not require the invention of machinery. That's fucked up. Apart from that, they were agents who were distributing European imports. When Britain was the world's leading economic power, it used to be referred to as a nation of shopkeepers, but most of the goods in their shops were produced by themselves. And it was wild grappling with the problems posed by production that their engineers came up with so many inventions. In Africa, the trading groups could make no contribution to technological improvement because their role and preoccupation took their minds and energies away from production. Apart from inventiveness, we must also consider the borrowing of technology. When a society, for whatever reason, finds itself technologically trailing behind others, it catches not so much by independent inventions, but by borrowing, catches up. Indeed, very few of man's major scientific discoveries have been separately discovered in different places by different people. Once a principle or a tool is known, it spreads or diffuses to other peoples. Why did the European technology fail to make its way into Africa during the many centuries of contact between the two continents? The basic reason is that the very nature of Afro-European trade was highly unfavorable to the movement of positive ideas, and techniques from the European capitalist system to the African pre-capitalist, communal, feudal, and pre-feudal system of production. So, that's in a pretty direct way, right? Getting at the idea that our economic relations are social relations, and quite literally, these colonizers who are having contact with Africa and talking to different local leaders and what we would think of as localities and whatnot are just quite literally never telling people about all the different advances that exist, so that trade and good non-exploitative relations could be facilitated. So they never have any intention on sharing any of this information to allow Africa to grow, because the plan is exploitation from the moment that Europe necessarily comes into contact. I had never thought about it like that, but that makes a lot of sense. Think about the fact that they could have been sharing shit with Africa the whole time. The logic of colonialism necessarily means they were never going to do that. That's wild. Far be it for Africa to be kept on the same footing with Europe, huh? So The only non-European society that borrowed effectively from Europe that became capitalist is that of Japan. Japan was already a highly developed feudal society progressing towards its own capitalist forms in the 19th century. Its people were neither enslaved nor colonized by Europe, and its foreign trade relations were quite advantageous. For instance, Japanese textile manufacturers had the stimulus of their own growing uh, internal market and some abroad in Asia and Europe. Uh, Under those circumstances, the young Japanese capitalist class, including many former feudalist landowners, borrowed technology from Europe and successfully domesticated it before the end of the 19th century. The use of this example from outside of Africa is meant to emphasize that for Africa to have received European technology, the demand would have had to come from inside Africa, and most probably from a class or group who saw a profit in the new technology. There had to be both willingness on the part of the European to transfer technology and Africa's social-economic structures capable of making use of the technology and internalizing it. Literally, damn. If I had just read the next paragraph before ranting, he literally was saying the same damn thing I was just saying. Those conclusions, yo. You be on the same wavelength with a motherfucker. And know what they gonna say before you even read it. Hunting for elephants or captives did not usually induce in Africa a demand for any technology other than firearms. The lines of economic activity attached to foreign trade were either destructive, or as slavery was, or at best purely extractive, like ivory hunting and cutting camwood trees. Therefore, there was no reason for wanting to call upon European skills. The African economies would have had little room for such skills unless negative types of exports were completely stopped. A remarkable fact that is seldom brought to light is that several African rulers in different parts of the continent saw the situation clearly and sought European technology for internal development, which was meant to replace the trade in slaves. That thing about the firearms part is like really interesting to me because like one of the like necessary implications of what he's saying here, because he's saying that like the demand for the transfer of these goods from Europe would have had to be like prevalent in Africa, and then they would have had to see like a practical need and have like a practical apparatus to put the technology into use, right? But like, so here he mentions like there's the demand for fire arms in order to like hunt the elephants, but if you're like from the European standpoint, underselling the effectiveness of whatever technology you have told them about, like you might like be painting, you know, the firearms you do have as like inefficient. And like if you're gonna like make it work, you're gonna need them in bulk. So like rather than being like, oh, you could buy like a handful and hand them to like a few elite African hunters, you're like having to enter into like a long-term exploitative contract at probably below market rate so that the like Europeans can like profit off of this endeavor. Meanwhile, the whole time it's being sold to you as like necessary for you to do so for your own development so that you can get access to the technology. Like that's some shameful shit. Shameful. And of course, that probably makes sense from the African standpoint because they're like, well, we got a lot of Africans, you know, so if we got to put a lot of guns in a lot of Africans' hands, so fucking be it. That's crazy as hell. So, Europeans deliberately ignored those African requests that Europe should place certain skills and techniques at their disposal. This was an element in the Congo situation of the early 16th century, which has already been mentioned. It happened in Ethiopia, though in Ethiopia, no trade in captives was established with Europeans. A Portuguese embassy reached the Ethiopian court in 1520, having examined Portuguese swords, muskets, cloths, books, and other objects. The Emperor Lebna Dengo felt the need to introduce European technical knowledge into Ethiopia. Correspondence exists between the emperor and European rulers such as Kings Manuel I and John III of Portugal and Pope Leo X, in which requests were made for European assistance to Ethiopian industry. Until late in the 19th century, Ethiopian petitions to that effect were being repeated with little or no success. So, like, what assistance is being requested is like they're being told to like fuck off. So like they're trying to facilitate no development because you can't help people if you're going to facilitate their exploitation at the same time. That would be contradictory. especially for the capitalist. In the first half of the 18th century, there were two further examples of African rulers appreciating European technology and stating their preference for skills and non-slave ships. When Agaja Trudeau of Dahomey sought to stop the trade in captives, he made an appeal to European craftsmen, and he sent an ambassador to London for that purpose. One European who stayed at the court of Dahomey in the late 1720s told his countrymen that if any tailor, carpenter, smith, or any other sort of white man that is free be willing to come here, he will find very good encouragement. That's in the Sandahani Apokuware from 1722 to 1750. Also asked Europeans to set up factories and distilleries in Asante, but he got no response. Bearing in mind the history of Japan, it should be noted that the first request for technical assistance came from the Ethiopian and Congo empires, which in the 16th century were at a level undoubtedly comparable to most European feudal states, with the important exception that they had not produced the seeds of capitalism. During the 18th century, the great African states of Dahomey and Asante became prominent. They had passed out of the communal stage and had a somewhat feudal class stratification, along with specialization in many activities such as the working of gold, iron, and cloth. Asante society under Apokuware had already shown a capacity for seeking out innovations by going to the trouble of taking imported silk and unraveling it so as to combine the silk threads with cotton to make the famous kente cloth. In other words, there would have been no difficulty in such African societies mastering European technical skills and bridging the rather narrow gap which existed between them and Europe at that time. Well into the 19th century, Europe displayed the same indifference to requests for practical assistance from Africa. Although by that period, both African rulers and European capitalists were talking about replacing slave trade. In the early 19th century, one king of Calabar in eastern Nigeria wrote the British asking for a sugar refinery. While around 1804, King Ndizozin of Cahomi was bold enough to ask for a firearms factory. So they're trying to get the shit produced in their own damn country. By that date, so they understand what the game is by that point. Who knows how long they had understood the game. By that date, many parts of West Africa were going to war with European firearms and gunpowder. There grew up a saying in Dahomey that, quote, he who makes the powder wins the war, close quote. That's a good point. Which was a far-sighted recognition that Africans were bound to fall before the superiority of Europeans in the fields of arms technology. Of course, Europeans were also fully aware that their arms technology was decisive and there was not the slightest chance that they would have agreed to teach Africans to make firearms and ammunition. Both the colonizer and the colonized understand the vital importance of having control of production, and not just the actual products, but the producing of said product. That's good shit. That the colonized of today. And the more we come to understand that, the more we realize, well, shit, technically we already own that shit. We already produce it. We just need to surrendering it to these motherfuckers. That's going to be a powerful day when people decide, yeah, we're going to freeze the capitalists out of their profit by holding back the shit that they'd be selling. We'll see what happens when that happens. The circumstances of African trade with Europe were favorable to creating a consistent African demand for technology relevant to development. And when that demand was raised, it was ignored or rejected by the capitalists. After all, it would not have been in the interest of capitalism to develop Africa. In more recent times, Western capitalists had refused to build the Volta River Dam for Ghana under Kwame and Nkrumah until they realized that the Czechoslovakians would do the job. They refused to build the Aswan Dam for Egypt, and the Soviet Union had to come to the rescue. And in a similar situation, they placed obstacles in the way of the building of a railway from Tanzania to Zambia. And it was the socialist state of China that stepped in to express solidarity with Africans, peasants, and workers in a practical way. Placing the whole question in a historical perspective allows us to see that capitalism has always discouraged technological evolution in Africa and blocks Africa's access to its own technology. As will be seen in a subsequent section, capitalism introduced in to Africa only such limited aspects of its material culture as were essential to more efficient exploitation. But the general tendency has been for capitalism to underdevelop Africa in technology. So, like, that's interesting because, like, what's being implied here then is that, like, there was an assessment by the capitalist of, European countries, the budding US, etc., of whether or not it would be profitable to engage in certain kinds of development of Africa. And they have made the assessment that Africa in some ways was not worth, participating in growing. So like they didn't want to grow the firearm industry in Africa or let it even be developed in any way, not just not grow it. They straight up didn't want to allow any production, any teaching at all to Africans of like being able to make those kind of weapons. And so like the question then becomes, is that a question of them not feeling like they can profit? Or is that a question of them feeling like that's against their interest, even if they could profit? Because like now in modern era in 2021, we see like the front loading of like profit and like the hyper exploitation that exists in 2021, where just everything is front loaded to as much of an extent as they can afford to do. And that's the calculus, try to upload as much money up front as possible. But like was like getting as much as you can, not always necessarily front of their calculus, at this time. That's kind of curious to me. Like, what are like the priorities? Is it just profit, or is there other things going on? Or is this like an analysis of like the long term for them when they're just like, yeah, no guns in Africa if we can fucking help it, so that's something for y'all to think about, like what the logic of the colonial powers that are saying no firearm development, what their logic must be. Let me see. So Zoe says, just like slaves had to be given crude tools so they wouldn't destroy them, Africans couldn't be given weapons manufacturing or other truly critical sources of production so they couldn't turn them on Europe. Yeah, like that has to be part of the calculus, right? But like, and I mean, depending on the era, it's not like there aren't events in the world that are like aiding this calculus alone. When you talk about like the rising up in Haiti and whatnot, like they may very well have just freshly begun to learn the lessons of like sowing the seeds of like discontent and like sowing the seeds of y'all's own destruction, which is what Marx says the capitalists are always doing. So yeah, that's these people are like trying to learn from events, I guess. It's like the main thing. So it has now become common knowledge that one of the principal reasons why genuine industrialization cannot easily be realized in Africa today is that the market for manufactured goods is any single African country is too small, and there is no integration of the markets across large areas of Africa. The kind of relationship which Africa has had with Europe from the very beginning has worked in the direction opposite the integration of local economics. Certain international links established on the continent were broken down after the 15th century because of European trade. Several examples arose on the West African coast down to Angola, because in those parts European trade was most voluminous, and the surviving written record is also more extensive. When the Portuguese arrived in the region of modern Ghana in the 1470s, they had few commodities to offer the inhabitants in exchange for the gold converted by Europe. However, they were able to transship from Benin and Nigeria supplies of cotton cloths, beads, and female slaves, which were sellable on the Gold Coast. The Portuguese were responding to a given demand on the Gold Coast, so that the previous trade must have been in existence between the people of Benin and those of the Gold Coast, particularly the Akan. The Akan were gold producers, and the people of Benin were specialist craftsmen who had a surplus of cloth and beads, which they manufactured themselves. As an expansionist state with a large army, Benin also had access to prisoners of war, while the Akan concerns with building their own population and labor force. So the latter acquired female captives from Benin and rapidly integrated them as wives. While the Portuguese intervened in this exchange, it was subordinated to the interest of European trade. As soon as Portugal and other European nations had sufficient goods so as not to be dependent on the re-export of certain commodities from Benin, then all that remained were the links between the gold export in Europe on the one hand and between Benin and Europe on the other. Man, the shit that you end up reading about when you understand that humans themselves have been commodified by the logic of capitalism. It's fucking wild. Jesus. Probably Benin products had reached the Gold Coast by way of the creeks behind the coast of what is now Dahomey and Togo. Therefore, it would have been more convenient when Europeans established a direct link across the open area. As pointed out earlier, the superiority of European at sea wars was of the greatest strategic value, along with their organizational ability. This was illustrated in several places, beginning with the Maghreb and Mauritania. After the Portuguese took control of the Atlantic coast of northwest Africa, they were able to secure horses, woolen goods, and beads, which they shipped further south to West Africa for gold and slaves. Up to the early 16th century, the most important article bought by the Portuguese for trade in Senegambia was the horse. In exchange for one horse, they received as many as 15 captives. North African woolens and beads were also utilized by the Portuguese in buying gold on the river Gambia and as far south as Sierra Leone. It needs to be recalled that the Western Sudan had links with the West African coast and with North Africa. Long before the European arrival, horses were moving from North Africa to be interbred with local West African stock long before European arrival. The Arabs and Mauritanians traveled to the river Senegal and further south to meet the Mandinga Jola traders and hand over to them products such as beads made in Ceuta and cloth spun from the wool of North African sheep. With the advantage of rapidly transport by sea as opposed to overland across the desert, the Portuguese were in effect breaking up the economic integration of the region. As with the Benin Akan example, the point to note is that after the Portuguese became middlemen, they had the opportunity of developing a new trade pattern by which Northwest Africa and West Africa looked to Europe and forgot about each other. A similar situation came into existence on the Upper Guinea coast, and this time, the European exploitation was aided by the presence of white settlers in the Cape Verde Islands. The Portuguese of the Cape Verde settlers broke into the Cape Verde settlers broke into the pattern of local Upper Guinea trade ever since the 1470s. They intervened in transfers of raw cotton and indigo dye from one African community to another, and the Cape Verdean settlers established a flourishing cotton growing and cotton manufacturing industry. They used labor and techniques from the mainland and exported the finished products along the length of the coast down to Accra. The Portuguese also took over the trade in cowries in the Congo and its offshore islands. The trade in salt along the Angolan coast and the trade in high-quality palm cloth between northern and southern Angola. In some instances, they achieved dominance, not just because of their ships and commercial skills, but also by the use of force, providing they were operating on the coast and could bring their cannon into use. In East Africa, for instance, the Portuguese used violence to capture trade from the Arabs and Swahili. The disruption of African commerce between the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast followed that pattern. A strong coastal canal trade existed between these two regions, with the people of Cape Lahore, modern Ivory Coast, selling past Cape 3 Points to sell their cloth as far east as Accra. The Portuguese set up a fort at Axum near Cape 3 Points to serve as gold with the hinterland, and one of its functions was to chop the east-west coastal African trade. They banned Axum residents from going to Cape Lahore, and they stopped canoes from the Ivory Coast, from traveling east beyond Axum. The purpose was obviously to make both these areas separate economic entities exclusively tied to Europe. The above-mentioned African commerce proved to have roots. The Dutch found it still going on when they took over Axum in 1637. The servants of the Dutch West India Company, there goes that name again, which was operating on the Gold Coast, wanted to put a complete stop to the African trade. And when that was not achieved, they tried to force the people of the Ivory Coast to buy a certain amount of Dutch goods. The Dutch ruled that each Axum canoeman going to Cape Lahode should carry Dutch goods worth at least 4 ounces of gold. The purpose was to convert a purely inter-African exchange into a European-African trade, which was what was doubly detrimental to African attempts to integrate their, which was doubly detrimental to African attempts to integrate their economies, was the fact that when Europeans became middlemen in local trade networks, they did so mainly to facilitate the extraction of captives, and thereby subordinated the whole economy to the European slave trade. In Upper Guinea and the Cape Verde Islands, the Portuguese and their mulatto descendants engaged in a large variety of exchanges involving cotton, dyes, cola nuts, and European products. The purpose of it all was to fill the holds of slave ships. In Congo and Angola, the same picture emerges. The salt cowrie, shells, and palm cloth came in Portuguese hands. It's made up for their shortage of trade goods and served to purchase captives on the different parts of the coast and deep in the interior. The element of subordination and dependence is crucial to an understanding of African underdevelopment today, and its roots lie far back in the era of international trade. It is also worth noting that there is a type of false or pseudo-integration, which is a camouflage for dependence. In contemporary times, it takes the form of free trade areas in the formerly colonized sections of the world. Those free trade areas are made to order for the penetration of multinational corporations. It's crazy. From the 15th century onward, pseudo-integration appeared in the form of the interlocking of African economies over long distances from the coast, so as to allow the passage of human captives and ivory from a given point on the island to a given point on the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. For example, captives were moved from Congo through what is now Zambia and Malawi to Mozambique, where Portuguese, Arab, or French buyers took them over. That was not genuine integration of the economies of the African territories concerned. Such trade merely represented the extent of foreign penetration, thereby stifling local trades. The West African gold trade was not destroyed, but it became became directly dependent on European buyers by being diverted from the northward routes across the Sahara. Within the savanna belt of the Western Sudan, the trans-Saharan gold trade had nourished one of the most highly developed political zones in all Africa from the 5th century onwards. But it was more convenient for Europe to obtain the gold on the west coast than through North African intermediaries. And one is left to speculate on what might have occurred in the West Sudan if there had been a steady increase in the gold over the 17th and 18th centuries. Nevertheless, there is something to be said in favor of African trade with Europe in this particular commodity. Gold production involved mining and an orderly system of distribution within Africa, and Kan country and parts of Zimbabwe and Mozambique sustained flourishing socio-political systems up to the 19th century, largely because of gold production. Certain benefits are also derived from the export of ivory. The search for ivory became the most important activity in several East African societies at one time or another, sometimes in combination with the trade in captives. The Wanyamwezi of Tanzania were East Africa's best-known traders, acquiring their reputation through carrying goods for hundreds of miles between Lake Tanganyika and the Indian Ocean. When the Wanyamwezi gave their attention to the export of ivory, this sparked off other beneficial developments, such as increased trading in hoes, food, and salt between themselves and their neighbors. Yet ivory was an asset that was rapidly exhausted in any given region, and the struggle to secure new supplies could lead to violence comparable to that which accompanied the search for human captives. Besides, the most decisive limitation of ivory trade was the fact that it did not grow logically from local needs and local production. Large quantities of ivory were not required by any society inside Africa, and no African society turned to elephant hunting and ivory collection on a big scale until the demand came from Europe or Asia. Any African society which took ivory export seriously then had to restructure its economy so as to make ivory trade successful. That in turn led to excessive and undesirable dependence on the overseas markets and the external economy. There could be growth in the volume of commerce and the rise of some positive side effects, but there was decrease in capacity to achieve economic independence and self-sustaining social progress. Besides, at all times, one must keep in mind the dialectical opposite of the trade in Africa, namely production in Europe or in America under European control. The few socially desirable byproducts of elephant hunting within Africa were chicken feed in comparison with the profits, technology, and skills associated with the product in Europe. In that way, the gap between Africa and Europe was constantly widening, and it is on the basis of that gap that we arrive at development and underdevelopment. So we're going over quite a lot in section 4.2, aren't we all? Because like he's not only talking about the gap in raw resources and even in the gap in production. He's talking about making sure that the gap continues to widen by making sure that, like, by Europeans doing a calculus that they're going to make sure Africans never even get the skills necessary to try to bridge this gap. Now, necessarily, that logic is coming from a chauvinistic place. This idea that European understanding of those skills would always be the status quo, that we would never be able to develop those skills without them. That's necessarily their like fundamental mistake in their logic. But like that logic seems to be playing out in how they craft economic policy, because we were talking about the firearms earlier and them not wanting to facilitate that economy in Europe, but even like industries that are not necessarily useful in Africa, according to what Rodney's writing here. He was writing at the end about ivory, and that not being any kind of major economy until the interference of Europe. So like, they're both keeping away from Africa what it needs, and then focusing on making Africa have to like overly rely on structuring its economy around a resource that Africa itself hardly has any use for. You know, so like no gun production, but y'all can have like this ivory based economy, and like that is mostly to like the benefit of the Europeans. Like that shit, you know, that shit is dastardly. The idea of like having to survive on resources that don't even necessarily benefit you materially. Like, that's some pretty violent shit. So he says a similar situation came into existence on the Upper Guinea coast. And this time, the European exploitation was aided by the presence of white settlers in the Cape Verde Islands. The Portuguese and the Cape Verde settlers broke into the pattern of local Upper Guinea trade ever since the 1470s. They interfered in transfers of raw cotton and indigo dye from one African community to another, and the Cape Verdean settlers established a flourishing cotton growing and cotton manufacturing industry. They used labor and techniques from the mainland and exported the finished products along the length of the coast down to Africa. So, like, and not only is it in addition to what we were just talking about like promoting an economy built around one resource that Africa isn't historically focused on and denying another resource. That's not only happening, but at the same time, traditional mutually beneficial trade that Africa might be engaging in with other Africans, the Europeans are quite literally going in and cutting off those markets. So you're bleeding Africa culturally, you're bleeding Africa economically, all for the hyper profit and all to like try to make try to make it so that gap's never going to be closed. And then he talks about all the different ways while engaging in this exploitative relationship that the European countries then also try to make this relation more efficient. You know, which what do we know about efficiency under capitalism. What do they mean when they say efficiency? They're talking about getting more product out faster, you know. And so, like, what necessarily does that like mean? Like, what is the consequence of efficiency? You're talking about, you know, more overworked Africans. You're talking about more exploited Africans. Africans were probably getting less sleep, less time to eat. That's probably putting them into contact with like and confrontation with Europeans that end up turning violent, you know, and like that's still played out today. The idea that like capitalists want things in a way that is not sustainable and like to like our social relationships, you know, and they violently engage with anybody who can't like meet their unreasonable demands for production, you know. So that's another thing that was coming to mind from this. Other than that, yeah, I appreciate y'all being here. We'll get this up on YouTube in the next few days. Typically no later than the day before the next reading, but sometimes quicker. And until then, solidarity, comrades. Y'all know I love y'all, and I will see y'all next Tuesday for the next reading of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Y'all take care.